Hello and welcome to the Law School Playbook. Today's topic is rule synthesis. So let's just start with the basics. What is synthesis? You probably have heard this word in other contexts in your life. Generally, it means combining ideas to form a theory or a system. Perhaps you talked about it in your chemistry course. There's chemical synthesis. Here we're talking about synthesizing rules. So we start with a rule or maybe no rule at all, right? And use cases, here 1, 2, 3, to derive a rule or to lend clarity to a rule. So let's just talk about our starting point, the center here. In practice, you almost always start with a statute. There's almost always a rule, a written rule that you are using to make an argument. In law school, in contrast, we don't always start with a statute. More often we deal with what's called common law, so the law that's derived in cases. So if you start with a rule, such as a statute or regulation, cases often lend clarity to that rule. Other times when you don't have a rule, you will be pulling the rule from those cases. Both types of synthesis give further dimension and further understanding to what the rule or what the law is. So, and here I have 1, 2, 3 cases as an example. Sometimes it will be a lot more than that. I just have that for purposes of this illustration. So let's just take a common everyday rule. No running in the halls. We've all heard this rule. Anyone who's been through education has heard this, no running in the halls. And we think at first blush, oh, we have an understanding of what that rule means. But the cases will give further dimension or further understanding as to how the rule works. So let's look at 3 specific cases that involve running in the halls. So first, in the first case, the student was late for class, and so the student was running in the hall. In that case, the student was given a detention. In the next case, the student was running in the hall, likely to get to the nurse because the student had a bleeding nose. In that case, the student did not receive a detention. In the third case, the student was joking around and running in the halls, and that resulted in a detention. So what can we take away from these cases that tells us, that further informs us about what no running in the halls means? Well, the student with the bleeding nose didn't get a detention. So I think that's telling us something and providing a bit of clarity to the rule. So here, we've added that into the rule to try and formulate a statement that would be applicable to future similar cases. So that might look something like this. Detentions are given for running in the halls, except an exception if the running is related to medical necessity. That seems to make sense here. So in the cases where you're late for class, where you're joking around, those result in a detention. But an exception was granted because of the bleeding nose. So here we'll call that medical necessity so that we can apply it to other cases that don't necessarily involve a bleeding nose, but perhaps involve some other type of medical condition. Okay, so let's take it further. Let's introduce a 4th case. So a student was running in the hall who, when stopped, said, "I have a headache," and that student was given a detention. So what do we think when we compare the bleeding nose to the headache in trying to synthesize a rule that we could use in future cases? And now you see the rule is coming into sharper focus. So we might say something like this: detentions are given for running in the halls, except if the running is related to an urgent medical necessity. So I think we can make a distinction between the bleeding nose and the headache based on its urgency. And that might be the rule that we synthesize for use in future cases in an effort to determine if a detention will be given or not. Now we have a 5th case, and that student was running in the hall because the student needs to use the restroom. How does that one come out? So we know the rule is detentions are given for running in the halls, except if the running is related to an urgent medical necessity. And the question then becomes, is having to use the restroom closer to the bleeding nose, or is that closer to the headache? How does this rule apply? And what is our prediction about whether or not this student is going to receive a detention? And in this case, we are the attorney. We are the person who needs to argue either that this case is very much like the bleeding nose, and therefore the student should not be given a detention. It's an urgent medical necessity when you have to go to the restroom. And we would try and distinguish the case about the headache and say, well, this is not comparable to the headache because there was urgency involved. A headache can wait. Needing to go to the restroom perhaps cannot. So this is all about making an argument. So using precedent cases, synthesizing a new rule, and then making an argument based on the prior cases to show how they're similar or different. Okay, so when students are making an argument, and frankly attorneys, what are some common problems with those arguments, with the rule synthesis? Often, particularly new students, point to the outcome in the precedent case and the desired outcome in the current case, but fail to connect the two. The student will not explain the similarity between the precedent case and the current case. So an example might be, if the person gets stopped, the person may say to the teacher, but David didn't get a detention when his nose was bleeding, so I shouldn't get a detention either. And that's the student who has to go to the restroom, of course. But does that really explain why a nosebleed is like going to the restroom? Perhaps we can infer it. But if you are making a legal argument, if you are writing an exam answer, you don't want your professor or the judge to have to infer from what you've written. You want to connect the dots for the reader or whomever is consuming your information. So that's a common mistake. You have to explain the similarity or the difference to the precedent case. So sound synthesis, in contrast, will point to the outcome in the precedent case and the desired outcome in the current case, but explain the similarity. So an example might be if the student said, you granted an exception for David based on an urgent biological need. I likewise had an urgent biological need to go to the restroom. Therefore, I shouldn't get a detention. And by framing it this way, calling it an urgent biological need, giving it that name or that label, how does the headache fit in? I think the headache is likely distinguishable because that does not have the same urgent biological need that both of these precedent cases do. Another thing that might help in arguing for a certain outcome is considering the policy, which is the reason for the rule, right? So why was an exception granted based on the nosebleed? Was it the exception granted because blood is a biohazard or to avoid embarrassment, right? So this would give perspective to different cases. So running related to vomiting would also be a biohazard, but if the reason was because having a nosebleed is embarrassing, then running because your pants split might qualify, right? So the policy also gives us some room to argue if we explore the reason for the rule about an outcome in a particular case. So that is the basics of synthesis. We can explore it further. If you're looking for more information, you could always check out lawschoolplaybook.com or my podcast, as well as my videos here. Thank you for joining us today, and you can do it. And as always, I will be rooting for you. Thanks.